you grow up, and today it's a hot topic, right? They talk about indoctrination. They talk about, the loyalty to your country, and, do you pledge allegiance to the flag? Do you not pledge allegiance to the flag? These schools are wrestling with these ideas right now. When I grew up, it was very much, kind of like God, country, family ideology, right? So, family was one of the most important things that you had to you, and your country was also, and the opportunity to serve your country, which is why I was leaning towards law enforcement, and then also was leaning towards the military. But that was kind of distant ideas for me. Federal law enforcement was the way that I wanted to go because I felt that in the federal government, you would have a greater impact on significant crimes that affected communities, affected people individually or even in the larger scope of things. So I think that dedication to helping people and wanting to help people was what drove me to that.
Okay, audience, we are here for the last of my Southern California interviews. Even though my guest doesn't live in Southern California, he definitely worked here before. Very excited because I have not talked to a Secret Service person before. Yesterday, spoke to a DSS agent. Very fascinated about what they do, but I think you're going to find this interview very interesting. So, with that being said, can you introduce yourself for me, please?
Yeah, absolutely. My name is Richard LaTulip, and yeah, as you mentioned, lived in San Diego, but currently living elsewhere right now. But back here for conferences regarding security.
Okay, and who was your career with?
So my career was started with the United States Border Patrol. Spent about a year and 8 months with them, and then I switched over in August of 1998 to the United States Secret Service, where I finished that entire career. 25 years of service in total, 22 years with the United States Secret Service, and retired in December of 2020.
Okay. Okay. So, same question I ask begin all my interviews with. Can you give me a little bit of background about yourself, your family, where you grew up? Student? Are you into sports? Are you studious? But ultimately, what led you to law enforcement?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I grew up in Indiana, right, the northwest Indiana area. So most everything we got was Chicago news. Grew up in that area, went to high school in that area, and then it came time for deciding about college and where to go and what to do. And then at that time, I was drawn towards either like a military, law enforcement, or other type of career. I was very interested in legal, and so I did try locally the satellite college for Indiana University, but it reminded me way too much of high school, and so that was not necessarily I wanted to continue as being in high school. So I pivoted and went down to Bloomington, Indiana, where I spent the most of the remainder of my college career down there, kind of bouncing back and going visiting family and coming back home. But I studied criminal justice and was looking at the opportunity to go into the law school. I don't think my grades were probably quite good enough, and I got to the point where, do you really want to get even that much further in debt with the college, costs on the rise, and even back then, right, they were fairly expensive to go per semester, and the law school was just an added plus 4 years more of studying. So I ended up, my mom called me one day and told me about the US Border Patrol and how they had openings, they were doing expedited hiring, and so I just go, why not apply for this and see where that takes me. I did look at DEA, Secret Service, FBI, but most of the, at least, information that I was receiving from recruiters is they were looking for some type of other experience. Now, my plan would be, because of that, right? If the Border Patrol, I was not successful in that interview process, to maybe go with a short career with the US military, or maybe even local law enforcement. But that was not where I wanted to end up in life. So, luckily for me, I was able to go through the US Border Patrol hiring process, got through that fairly easily. It was an interesting interview that I did have with some of their recruiters where they were asking me questions. Never being in law enforcement and probably having a movie style thought on it. When they ask me, hey, you've got a suspect, he's running, he won't listen to your commands, what do you do? Right? You're giving chase, you're trying to use your radio, and everything that I would say to him, it didn't matter what it was some type of blocker. If you were, hey, I was a track star in college, so I'd outrun the guy. Well, he's faster than you. If you were, wanting to cross a river, there would be no way to forge it, and you can't swim. And so finally it got to the point where in frustration, I'm like, okay, my radio doesn't work, my cell phone doesn't work, I can't swim, I can't run, so I'll fire a warning shot. Of course, they went ballistic, yelling at me like, how dare you fire a warning shot? Like, do you understand what can happen? And I was just, of course, very, very frightened at that point, because again, all the movies I saw is like, they shoot warning shots, right? That was something you thought instinctively. And of course, that was the wrong answer. But ultimately, their goal was, and I think I carried that throughout the course of life, is what is it that you can think about, and how is it you can overcome a challenge? What is it that you do? How does your mind work? Do you give up immediately? Do you continue finding out, solutions to the problem, and, adapting, overcoming, and at one point succeeding? So started with, like I said, with the Border Patrol, and then switched over and Secret Service.
But was there something growing up that led you to go, hey, I want to go in some branch of law enforcement? I mean, was it playing cops and robbers? I mean, what was it?
I mean, it's. I think that you grow up, and today it's a hot topic, right? They talk about indoctrination. They talk about the loyalty to your country, and do you pledge allegiance to the flag? Do you not pledge allegiance to the flag? These schools are wrestling with these ideas right now. When I grew up, it was very much kind of like God, country, family ideology, right? So, family was one of the most important things that you had to you, and your country was also, and the opportunity to serve your country, which is why I was leaning towards law enforcement, and then also was leaning towards the military. But that was kind of distant ideas for me. Federal law enforcement was the way that I wanted to go, because I felt that in the federal government, you would have a greater impact on significant crimes that affected communities, affected people individually, or even in the larger scope of things. So I think that dedication to helping people, and wanting to help people, was what drove me to that. Also, there was this I guess the way you painted government. My idea of government going into it was completely different than exiting it. Right? You believe that the people who represent the United States had everyone's best interest at heart. You believe that the country was put forth first by everything. And I think as you even start consuming news, and you start reading, and you start becoming more, let's just say, in tune with what goes around you. 9/11, when that happened, I mean, the first thing that I did was volunteered. And, my colleagues didn't necessarily recognize that I volunteered on day one, driving into the office, and hearing it on the radio, understanding how it kind of like draws you in. And I was a little bit too old at that time to go to the military. So the best thing I could do is, what can I do? Can I be part of a joint terrorism task force? As you know, there were multiple terrorists that were in San Diego, and I participated in those investigations. Those were, above all, the most important thing that you can have at any point in your life at that moment in time. And it drew you to it, right? And so that's kind of what drew me to law enforcement, and serving for a higher purpose, a greater good, protecting, the financial infrastructure, right, for the U.S. Secret Service's main thing, besides the protection of the United States government, right? I think people forget at times Secret Service was created for that purpose of protecting our financial infrastructure, and making sure that the dollar was not only, let's just say, reliable, but it was something behind it that stood, right? That you can count on it, you believed in it, and that gave you faith in its ability to buy or trade on the U.S. dollar.
Okay. Give me a little bit of background about once you got hired on with Border Patrol. How old were you?
So when I got hired with the Border Patrol, it was right out of college. So I was 22.
Okay, so 22. What are your primary responsibilities as Border Patrol at that point?
Really interesting, right? Assigned to the southwest border here, and at that moment, the let's just say the atmosphere where I was working in was very much a catch and prevent kind of idea. Whereas that, not that you had to have your lights and sirens on as you sat on the border, right? But you had to be highly visible. Your job was not to catch, it was to prevent.
Mm-hmm.
And so when persons would cross the border into the United States, it was more about trying to make them go back to Mexico. And if they did not go back, then you apprehended them, and then they were taken down to the station and processed. But it wasn't the enforcement side of it was a hot topic at that time, and it definitely was focused on the prevention and making sure that people knew that there were a lot of agents along the southwest border, right? Because highly visible positions, lights on, so to speak, where they could see you from the south border, and they might not want to cross. During the time that I worked for the U.S. Border Patrol, seniority gave you opportunities to work different shifts. Some people preferred days, some people afternoons, and then some were midnights. For me, it was midnights because there was more action on a midnight shift than there was in a day shift. So even led to an incident where, the southwest border, if you think about San Ysidro as one of the most crossed ports of entry for the United States, foot traffic wise, right? Otay Mesa, I think the one just down the road was for vehicle commercial traffic that was coming in, but for foot traffic, everything was coming through San Ysidro. That was where I was working, and it was a Halloween evening where I remember my partner and I were working, and another partner called out on the radio, shots fired. This is a midnight shift, so you're getting a lot of traffic on a Friday night coming back from Tijuana, and so obviously alcohol involved because it's easy to get anywhere for that matter, right? You can get alcohol, but shots fired, and we were close. We responded, and it was actually the hotel. It was near the hotel that I stayed in when I was onboarding for the U.S. Border Patrol, so I knew exactly where everything was going down, and my partner and I, we responded, and I remember that the bad guy jumping over the hood of my car and getting out on foot and pursuing him. My partner had a shotgun because he was always, for whatever reason, believed that the shotgun was the thing to have, which don't get me wrong, it's a great weapon, but I had just my pistol, and I think it was a rainy day or a rainy week that week. So, it was one of those ones where I didn't have my bulletproof vest on because you were always running on the border and it was a lot of extra weight. People always talk about like the type of things that you have with you and the stress that it causes your body, and having that extra weight on where you're hiking up and down hills and running consistently. I just chose that day not to wear my bulletproof vest, and I can remember getting out of the vehicle going, well, that was a day not to wear your bulletproof vest, right? And so got out, gave pursuit, and a vehicle passed on the backside of that hotel, and the person turned around to come back, not knowing that we had given pursuit. And literally, it's almost as if he ran directly into me and immediately put his hands up. And of course, I arrested him. He had the murder weapon on him. He had the money that he stole from the person that the shots fired were called from. And I even remember the San Diego police officer that was, the first question is, why didn't I shoot him? Because he had killed somebody, and, he had the murder weapon in his possession. And my simple answer was there was no reason to, because he was giving up. Why shoot a person and live with that burden for the rest of your life if
Yeah.
you don't have to? Now, don't get me wrong. He comes around the corner with guns blazing, different story.
Yeah.
But he was giving up. And so I said, it's simple, right? Yes, I understand what he did was a bad thing. But just because that happened, say, 20 minutes ago,
Yeah.
it's a different scenario, and you have to approach it. And that's a hard thing for law enforcement because your adrenaline is going at a uncontrollable rate. Your heart rate is way up to be able to make a calm decision and be able to say, hey, the threat wasn't present when I encountered him.
Did you know that he had murdered somebody at that point?
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay.
They called it out, shots fired, man down.
Wow.
So it was all being broadcast as you were going, right? So you're getting updates.
So had he just tried to do a robbery and just killed the
Yes.
person? Wow. Okay. Okay. So what makes you put in for the Secret Service? You're working Border Patrol, seems like a pretty exciting job. Why do you put in for Secret Service?
The Border Patrol, the way I saw it, was it would be a very exciting career, especially for someone that wants to be outdoors. But again, I was looking for a higher calling. I was looking for something that would be, the casework would be a lot more valuable to larger communities, right? When we start talking about bank fraud, we talk about credit card fraud. These are very, very impactful. And of course, it takes a lot of time, energy, and effort to investigate those types of cases. I felt that with foot traffic coming across the southwest border, I felt the political landscape at that particular time where you're encouraged to deter and kind of force back south was just not exciting to me. I felt like 25 years from now, would I be would I look back and say that was something that was very impactful?
Hmm.
And the answer that I had at that time was not for me. It wasn't for me. Not that I didn't enjoy working outside, but I do remember being in the academy for the Border Patrol, and the instructors, they always say this thing too, is just comical, is there are no stupid questions, right? And of course, they were talking about sign cutting. Coming from the college, my mind, sign cutting, I'm imagining, if you will, a sign that you're cutting in half, whatever it was, like do not enter or whatever it was. And I'm like, I'm going to ask a question. I don't know if this is a good question or not, but what are you talking about? And of course, he had to go in and like sign cutting is following human footprints on, on the ground and stuff like that. So I learned how to do that, but it was one of those things where in class, had no clue.
Yeah.
But again, not my calling, at least I didn't feel it. And I felt like, I had an idea in my mind that maybe I do 10, 15 years in the Secret Service and pivot over to the FBI. Change of landscape, change of work scope, and eventually it just kind of went out of my mind because I was having such a unique career with the Secret Service.
But why Secret Service? Why did you think about going to FBI? Did you think about any other federal agencies?
I did, but I ran into that situation where working with the U.S. Border Patrol, you start at least interacting at a small level, and you also have the ability to talk to people and get their opinions. The attractive thing for the Secret Service was the dual mission, the fact that you could do protection for a period of your career, and then you can actually do investigation. So when I first went in, that was attractive to me as well. DEA, I looked at the scope of what they enforced in terms of law enforcement. Not something that I really wanted to do. And so financial crimes and protecting our financial infrastructure, that just drew me in. And plus that, like I said, the idea, whereas today I could be working a case in San Diego, and tomorrow you could be protecting not just the president of the United States, but it could be a former president, or it could be a world leader.
Yeah.
So those things were attractive to me, and that kind of forced the hand to apply in that direction. Now, don't get me wrong, I did apply for other organizations because I feel like you don't put all your eggs in one basket. And but what I did is strategically applied for the Secret Service first, and then U.S. Marshals, DEA, and then FBI.
Got it. Got
And
it.
then when the offer letter came with the Secret Service first, mind you, if DEA would have came first, I may very well have said, yeah, I'll take the DEA job.
Yeah.
So, but I did it strategically.
Okay.
Whereas I purposely applied for the Secret Service, gave it about 5 months before I started applying elsewhere.
Okay. So I got a question before we go on and talk about your career. Firearms between Border Patrol and Secret Service. I always think Border Patrol guys are really good shots. They do a really nice job of teaching firearms. And I gotta imagine as a Secret Service agent, firearms has got to be top priority. What any opinion one way or another on that in terms of maybe who did it better or the difference in training between firearms?
So it's always an interesting question, right? When it comes down to your officially issued firearm, right?
Mhm.
I think when I went into it, I thought, well, I'm just going to go get any firearm, just on the border, whatever it was. And then you get quickly realize that there are policies, there are procedures, and these are your firearms. Each had different firearms that they selected through their own, criteria, what was important to them, what was not important to them. I think all federal agencies, through the academies, there's intense training as it relates around firearms because, you have the power to take a person's life, with that gun that you're issued. And in a law enforcement capacity, there's a realization that you, more than any other person, is going to come across an event that very easily can turn violent in, the snap of a finger. So I feel the training was very intense. Now, don't get me wrong, I think the Secret Service, what they ended up doing was a little bit more if you were on a presidential detail where your requirements qualify with your sidearm was monthly as opposed to quarterly. So there was a higher threshold.
Okay.
I remember in the Border Patrol when I was there, not saying it's still like this, but it was quarterly as well.
Yeah.
And when we were in the field with the Secret Service, it was also quarterly. We upped it. The only organization that I recall, right, at least in my career, fitness was also a high priority for the Secret Service, whereas not only did you have to qualify with your firearm every quarter, but you had to take a physical fitness test. And that was, again, recognizing there was a few things: proficiency in firearm and capability. Your capability, like if you're not capable of getting from, say, floor one on a working elevator environment to floor 10, then what good can you be to the partner when you eventually get there?
Yeah.
Most things that happen are very quick, right? They're over in a short period of time. So physical fitness is, whether it be crossing a 6 foot fence or whether it be crossing, 200 yards of ground, being able to do that and accomplish that and be ready to engage whatever the fight is. I think that as we saw, at least in my career, as you saw incidents occurring, physical fitness and firearms proficiency kind of go hand in hand, and you see that need to be able to be proficient in both. So I tried to do the best I could to always maintain a physical fitness standard, and also, be able to be as proficient as possible with a firearm, and those were kind of brought or preached to you by the two organizations that I was a part of.
Yeah.
And I know that throughout, U.S. government, whether it be the DEA, the FBI, or U.S. Secret Service, you know, that is something that is important. Now, we dispel these facts, right? That we are not taught to shoot guns out of people's hands. We're not taught to shoot you in the elbow. We're taught to shoot center mass, right, to stop the threat.
Yeah.
And use good judgment. Those are the things that we're taught to do. So
Okay. So let's talk about your career a little bit. I think it's fair to say that you did not have a typical career as a Secret Service guy, but focusing on typical, as a general rule, give me a breakdown of what a Secret Service agent would typically do.
yeah, I mean, typically, especially when I got out of the academy, you can expect 3 to 4 years of work in your field office of first assignment. So whether it be a smaller or medium-sized office like I went to, which was San Diego, or it be a large field office like LA, there was this idea that after your fourth year, for sure, you were going to be pivoting to a detail. And the detail could mean that you were part of the presidential detail or vice presidential or part of the dignitary protective detail, right? So then there was also, I guess, the last one, the fourth component of the former presidents. So you can then expect, depending on what assignment you were then chosen for, typically another 4 to 5 years. So you're putting at, if you look at it in terms of effectiveness and efficiency, say after 9 years, you've done those two different aspects of the career. Some people want to get promoted at that point, and they may want to say get their promotion within a detail, or they might want to go back to a field office. It's your choice. Some people choose to go back to a field office, they get promoted as an AT, or they go back as a senior agent. Not necessarily everyone gets promoted straight from a detail, so they would do that and then maybe get promoted later on. But the whole idea is once you have done those two, then the only other thing, which was a requirement that I recall, and I think things have changed in today's environment, but I started off in a small office. They like to have, they always refer to it as the big uglies, right? Doing in Miami or doing in New York or doing in LA. And then there was also the hard to staff that people didn't want to go to, maybe cost of living like a San Francisco, which was very expensive to live in. So there was also this idea that you would have to have that pain point at some point of your career if you're not starting there. Obviously, most agents were assigned to larger field offices because they were harder to staff, and they needed a lot more people, whether it be because they had a larger investigative requirement or they had a larger protection assignment. So a lot of people got assigned that. I did not. I got brought into San Diego, so that was a small office. So typically for me, I would have had to do a large office. I would have had to do a assignment for protection. You could expect also, because you're in DC, which was kind of norm, where all of our details like that, whether it be presidential or vice president, operated from, you would go to a headquarters assignment. That'd be something else that you would expect to have as part of your career. And then, of course, if you're looking at a typical 4 year assignment, you're at year 12. 20 years, depending on your age, is the minimum. So people would find maybe the opportunity to go back to their home place, right? So find a field office that's close to their home. It could be a resident office, it could be a field office, it could be a large office. So those are things that you also would see people do within the organization.
So, except for, give me an idea, special agent, except for executive protection that you're talking about, what other duties does a special agent with Secret Service do? And what's the breakdown? How often would a typical, again, we're going to get into your career, which is not, but how often would a typical agent work executive protection versus these other duties you're going to talk about?
The minimum requirement at the time, and this was always a changing goalpost, but the minimum requirement is 5 years.
Okay.
So after 5 years, you were free to choose, so to speak, what you wanted to do.
Okay.
Now, it could be, like I said, going back to it, and a typical agent would. So a lot of people that were recruited that came into the U.S. Secret Service, let's just say that the pinnacle of your career, and the most important thing that you can ever do for the U.S. Secret Service was to be on the presidential detail, and some people that was their only goal. So they would basically come in at a field office, and they would work there 4 years, and then that would be it. Their goal was to not only go to the presidential detail, but stay on the presidential detail, and they would do whatever they had to stay there and maintain that position.
But maybe I'm asking the question wrong. Let's say you're here in San Diego, you're starting your career, and you're not on the presidential detail, or you're not one of these exec. What is your day to day look like? I mean, what kind of other investigations are you working
I
on?
see. So in my field office, say for the first 4 years, what would you disparatively different, whether or not you're in a small office or a large office?
Yeah.
Large office, you could be expected to be on. When I started, we still had check fraud
Okay.
unit. They still had and then they had, which is still present today, a counterfeiting unit. As I saw very much when I was at the end of my career, they would have now these regional task forces that would be dubbed the electronic crimes task forces. So that became very heavy at the end. So your typical day, you could be, when I started, doing a check fraud case, which, if you remember, the United States government used to send, when you did your taxes every year, a nice goldenrod envelope with your check inside of it, which basically screamed "steal me." So a lot of people stole those things, and you can imagine that we had to investigate the theft of those U.S. Treasury checks, and that was something I remember doing quite a bit. And then the other thing too is, because you do have an opportunity, they call it the duty desk. So 1 week, maybe, depending on the total pool of agents, every 2 months you're on that duty desk where you're answering the phone for citizens calling in for potential crimes, or banks are calling in because of financial crimes that they've seen: bank fraud, wire fraud, access device fraud, which is credit card fraud, right? So you can catch one of those cases. Another one which they tried to get more senior agents on was our protective intelligence squads. They were, wherever anyone would make a threat against the president, they would be responding to those threats to interview those persons. So in a smaller field office, my day to day was, everything. I was not I was not shielded from a protective intelligence case. I was not shielded from a financial crimes case or a counterfeiting case or a check case. Larger field offices, they would do it that way. They would shield people, and they would end up, being in those squads. They like to term it as squads. Outside of that, when you were doing your investigations, if a protectee decided to come to San Diego, yes, today I could be doing an investigation, but tomorrow it could very easily be supplementing a protective detail that was coming into town, or you were supplementing the protective scheme that agents were going to be putting in place at an event. If, say, they were coming to visit they were doing a political rally and they were doing it here in San Diego, they would need assets to be able to protect those sites. They would need agents to be able to man this certain post that they identified as critical. And so you could get called from whatever field office to come to San Diego to be able to provide that protection for a point in time event. And then once that's done, that event, you would be released from that duty assignment. You go back to your field office and you would work back at your cases, whatever those cases were.
Okay. When you say counterfeit cases, are you talking about to live and die in LA counterfeit money, or are you talking about counterfeit product? What are you talking about?
So in the beginning, it was exactly to live and die in LA, right? So it was counterfeit U.S. currency. Um, but there were counterfeit checks. They could be bank checks, they could be otherwise.
Okay.
But typically, the counterfeit squad was only working your, let's say, home office printer, which was very popular when I was in the service. Whereas you can buy an all-in-one printer and put U.S. dollars on it and print out however many 20s or 50s or hundreds that you want to do. Sophistication rows where people would use chemicals to, so to speak, wipe the ink off of a $1 note because they were looking for the paper and the security features within the paper, and they would figure out, okay, I have to print this now, this 50 on this, say, a dollar bill, or this $5 bill. Of course, there were certain security features now when we started using watermark technology, or even the security thread or fiber that they would refer to it as. We'd put that in there. But most people, I would have to say, that are accepting currency, they're not necessarily paying attention to those security features. They look for a watermark, but they don't necessarily look for the difference between that it's supposed to be Grant versus Lincoln, and so or any at all, right? So the thing is you can get someone that's just not familiar with the security features of U.S. currency. They'll see a watermark or they'll see a thread. The threads in the fiber, or not the fiber, but the security thread was supposed to glow a color that was associated with a denomination.
Hmm.
So it was supposed to be red, but it really was pink for the $100 bill. If it glowed, I think it was blue for the $5 bill. If it was blue, you should know that the 100 that's based on it is not correct. But people weren't looking that deep. And
Yeah.
then there was these counterfeit detection pens that people wanted to use, but they were never very successful at defeating it because they knew they sold them at the store, right? You can go to your local store to pick up a counterfeit detection pen just like anyone else could. So the bad guys understood that this was something that was being used. So again, figure out what chemicals to apply. Typically it was hairspray, and the pen would never hit on it as it's supposed to. And if you washed your $100 bill in the laundry cycle because you forgot about it and you went and used it, then you would get a hit on a counterfeit detection pen because the substance that they use to help make currency last longer would get washed out from the cycle.
Huh.
So it was one of those ones where people would always ask, "Hey, should I use it?" I'm like, "Well, I can't tell you to or not to use it, but you should be familiar with what it can be done to defeat it and where your errors can come in from it." Right. So
Yeah.
it was always very interesting. Internationally was another thing that was always interesting because certain countries, depending on the year, I'm sure you've heard of the super note. Everyone's heard of the super note, right? But at that time when it was very prevalent, certain places that I had visited as well, they would say, "Hey, we're not accepting." I use this by way of example, but just say the 1995 series $100 bill. We're not going to accept it. We're only going to accept the new, like 1996, which was that big face bill. So it was always interesting to run into that, but it was just for fear of getting ripped off on the quote unquote super note, as opposed to understanding what the security features are. And if you understood what those were, then you could. But again, it's a training issue, it's education issue. And it's not easy to train your staff on those types of risks.
Okay. All right. So let's talk about your career. And I think it's fair to say that you had an atypical career with the Secret Service. You didn't do a lot of, I mean, if any, executive protection, but you were pretty much just doing investigations. What type of investigations did you start working on, and where did you develop your expertise? What was your
Sure.
expertise investigations?
So for my career, because it was uniquely different, is when I got assigned to the office, we had a very senior agent pool. And that pool did not see the value in our regional fraud task force. Me being new, coming from the U.S. Border Patrol, I worked quite extensively with the San Diego Police Department. So they call them a SAC, right? SAIC, Special Agent in Charge. Right out of the academy, coming in the new office, he's like, "Hey, what do you think about working in the Regional Fraud Task Force?" I'm like, "Sounds great to me, sir. Whatever you want me to do." And so that was how I started doing financial crimes.
Okay.
I got assigned to that fraud task force. And from there, what happened is, of course, working with some senior San Diego Police Department detectives, picking up some techniques from them of how to do investigations, learning very quickly that, yes, I went to college and I thought I knew how to write. I don't know how to write. And I had to learn a whole different new writing style. Organization of case management was also challenging. This was also, if you think about it, in 1998, when we would do a search warrant to a bank, or and this is why I talk about organization, right? Because as opposed to getting a floppy disk, right, we would get a box of paper documents. And sometimes I've got a full large box of X amount of reams of paper that were bank account information for a potential suspect. So you learn very quickly the need to organize. You learn very quickly the need to basically, structure your investigation appropriately, and so these were things that I started learning from the Regional Fraud Task Force. And as my career developed, I was working a variety of cases. Some were very significant. They were local cases here in San Diego. One of them was entitled Operation Song Sung Blue. It was about a person that was doing, he was interesting in how he was doing it. Basically, he was recruiting students who were exchange students to open lines of credit, and then he would get them to basically bust out those credit cards. But that wasn't where he won the money. He took the proceeds and went down to, I think it was Sequan Casino, and hit the jackpot. He won $999,000 on the jackpot, and of course that put his operation into high speed. But it was about, if I'm not messing it up. It was about 15 suspects that we arrested. He was one of them. But yeah, he was one of those winners, which was really kind of unique that happened. But it was a great case. From there, the supervisors in my office, because again, very senior office, very unique, they had trouble with computers, right? They didn't necessarily know how to install printers. They didn't necessarily know how to get programs running that they should. And so they would ask me for help at times. And so that kind of pivoted where it's like, hey, do you want to do computer forensics? You seem to be very good with computers because you knew how to put the driver on for a printer. So off I was to computer forensics school. But it was actually it was unusually helpful for me because this was also a stage where the government, at least the Secret Service and others, were recognizing that cybercrime, right, was a very very impactful thing. So this was probably around 2002 when this happened, and we also were recognizing that the people who did those cases were very few, and there was a large pool of people who wanted to do the details. So they were giving a reprieve for people who wanted to stay in a field office to do computer forensics. So joining the program, because it wasn't inexpensive to send someone to get trained of how to do computer forensics. It was a large investment. Plus, you wanted to recognize and realize that investment. So, you were guaranteed an additional 4 years in a field office. So that was appealing to me because after my first 4 years, where I did do a supplemental assignment to a protection opportunity here and there, I just got to the point where I realized that's not for me. I didn't want to do that any longer. So here was an opportunity to stay longer for sure in investigations. And that's the reason I also was absolutely saying, I will do computer forensics without a doubt, right? And then the other part that became apparent and part of that puzzle was, where does the future go, right? What direction of travel are we going in the future? And strategically saying, if I choose this, I may sacrifice promotability within the U.S. Secret Service. If that happens, how can I prepare myself for a secondary career in the private world?
Mm.
This was that avenue that I looked at. Whereas if you stay in cybersecurity and you focus on this, you will probably be very highly marketable once you finish your career with the Secret Service, even though you've sacrificed promotability.
Yeah, that's super. I mean, that's very interesting. How do you? I don't think many people would have that foresight to do that. I mean, can you look back and think about where that came? Because I mean, that's you're so right. I mean, what you did was certainly future proof yourself.
Yeah, and I think it was just recognition, right? I mean, everything was being done with computers, and everything that was being, especially your high profile. So one of the arguments that I had all the time with senior leadership within the Secret Service is they had this idea of, and I remember one of my supervisors, he would tell me, he's like, hey, at the school, a kid passed a counterfeit $20 bill. He bought school lunch with it. And he wanted me to go down to the school to interview the teacher, to interview the student, right? Call the parents. So there was a level of effort that you would have to do to go do this. And I remember him telling me that that's what he wanted me to do. And I looked at him and I said, are you kidding me? This is an absolute waste of my time. More importantly, I'm getting paid a lot of money by the US government to investigate cases that are impactful. His argument was, well, this is a federal arrest statistic. And my argument was that significant cases don't need those type of statistics, right? And more importantly, I believe at that time, even then, there were studies, whereas that you can look at what is the impact a person can have with a stolen credit card or a compromised bank account. And if you were to look at say, for example, took all of the in production counterfeit notes, if you pass them all at once, it still would not be as impactful as compromising, say, a very wealthy person's account that had millions, if not even more than that. When you start looking at some of these savings accounts that these groups had, retirement funds. If a retirement fund was compromised and all that money was stolen, it really puts into perspective how valuable is U.S. currency compared to what you can do with a computer. And I recognize that you can actually do more. A great example is in India, where they compromised the SWIFT and they transferred $1 billion from the bank to Malaysia. Now, luckily, most of that was recovered. They didn't lose all of that money, but the point being is that impacts a financial infrastructure of a country. $1 billion gone in a microsecond. and you have to take, say, for example, if you could get together $100 million worth of counterfeit currency, try passing $100 million of counterfeit currency at once. It's just not going to happen. But you could, within 1 second, steal $1 billion. You could do that.
I am
More impactful.
I am so glad that I'm hearing a story about how supervisors are not so great in your agency, just like they're in my agency, just like they're. It just that always drove me crazy. It's like, look, let's look at the big picture here. Okay, so your career, San Diego, you're in the embassy in Estonia, and you're at the Secret Service Cyber Threat Intel Unit. Tell me a little bit about what you did in Estonia.
Should I talk about how I got there? How I got there was more of an interesting
Yeah,
story
yeah,
than
absolutely.
it itself, right?
Okay.
Because when you start looking at cyber threat intelligence, you start looking at cybercrime, right?
Mm-hmm.
At let's just say I finished a case called Song Sung Blue in San Diego, which was a very good case. You talked about the total loss within the case; it was in the millions, right? If I'm not even mistaken, it was say like 10, $12 million worth of losses associated with that. But there was this new trend that was coming on, and everyone referred to it as the dark web. And some people would be like, "Oh, the deep and dark web," right? And they would try to justify it. They would even make these photographs of an iceberg. Of this is what we know, which is the tip of the iceberg, and then the bottom of the and then they would segregate where the deep and dark web went. But for the U.S. Secret Service, Operation Firewall was one of the first cases that kind of gave at least a wider picture, a broader audience, this glimpse into the world of cyber criminal activity. And it became very popular where whatever electronic crimes task forces that you had, very quickly they started picking up on these are the cases that we have to work, right? Because of the impact. We talked about that a little bit ago. What's the impact on our financial infrastructure? How does it go in terms of a federal officers? What should you be focusing your time and effort on, right? And these now multiple defendants crossing international borders, significant dollar loss, impactful, right? So these things were now the cases to have. And so we worked a local case that started off as a skimming operation, where skimming is, you have a local waiter or waitress at a store who would then be handed a credit card, and they would run it legitimately, and then they would run it illegitimately, and that would be the data that they would take, and they would then use that and put that on another credit card, and then go to a store and go use those credit cards, right? So that was very typical. That was also that time frame where that was highly advanced, it was highly technical. And I remember the suspect telling me when we were debriefing him on this particular case is that he went up to a store in LA. And when he was at that store in LA, he had a conversation with the shop owner, and he was introduced into this whole dark and deep web. And he's like, "Look, dude, you're doing it wrong. You're not being as efficient or effective as you could be." And he introduced him to this world, if you will. And we ended up arresting him, where he introduced me, and we ended up creating another case called Operation Card of Chaos. And this focused on us targeting some of the more prolific vendors of stolen data at that time on the illicit that marketplace, right? Marketplaces like Dumps Market or Verified or Mazafaka, these places that I just mentioned were marketplaces where a person can come create a very anonymous profile and start buying stolen credit card data, and they can then use that track data that was being sold to emboss on the credit cards. You removed yourself one layer from the store, so to speak, because you don't necessarily have to risk yourself in a store. One thing I think most waiters and waitresses didn't recognize is even at the store, there was accountability in terms of the transactions that you processed because of tips, right? Or other things like this. So you would have a number associated with. So it was very easy that if every card you touched was being skimmed, I could just take that data, I can go to the bank, and then I can go to the store manager and say, "Hey, here's 80 transactions. What person touched all 80 of these transactions? Oh, wow, look, it was this guy or
Mm.
that lady." And so it'd be very easy. Now you're removed from that at least immediate association, but you still have to use the card, right? In society, you still have to monetize it, so to speak, right? So there was still risk, wasn't completely, but you remove the layer of risk by being able to do this on that deep and dark web. So that led us into this case where we started targeting. Now, very, very much from Operation Firewall, it was a completely digital operation where they sat behind a computer, they had conversations with people, and they identified these people through, it could be bad operational security, it could be a mistake in terms of how they sent a package, where they used their personal address as opposed to a drop address. But nonetheless, they were able to create trust amongst the people that they were working with. And they got a lot of information about these people, and they ended up doing or executing search warrants where I believe that they arrested a significant number of people here locally in the United States, and it led to a couple arrests internationally. But that was all digital. That was the digital world. And so what we were looking at with ours, which was unique and a little bit groundbreaking, is we were going to change that. We were no longer just going to solely focus on the digital world. We're going to take the digital world and move it into the real world, because we wanted to make sure that whomever it was, like, you could literally say that you're Bill Cosby online, or any person that you want, right? Just pick a name. And the reality is that doesn't mean that that's the person who's behind the name that's making the claim. So we wanted to be able to say that you truly are the person that is online, and we need to get your identity. So that meant real world meetings, real world casework. So these people typically lived in Southeast Asia or in Eastern Europe. And so the goal was to build rapport, build a relationship in business, and turn it to, the real world, and attract these people to come to places, especially because if you live in certain regions of the world, the United States government doesn't have proper extradition treaties. And so therefore, they're less likely to be arrested unless they made a mistake and went to the wrong place in the world. So the idea was to draw them out, to create those relationships, and then we could then strategically say, after we've developed enough evidence and further identify the network of criminals that were part of these operations, to arrest and have a greater impact. So this led us to meeting, like I said, face to face with people over the 3-year period of time. After that case came to a conclusion and we made a lot of arrests, and we had a very significant impact, the opportunity presented itself to continue doing, which is what I wanted to do, staying in cyber in a different capacity. So our embassy, because we recognize, well, I shouldn't say our embassy, but our office at headquarters recognized that a lot of criminals were coming out of Eastern Europe, and we hadn't yet had an office in the Eastern European theater. So we looked at a great place to be able to put that. So we looked first at Latvia, then we looked at Lithuania, and then of course, decided on Estonia eventually. So it was a brand new office. The idea behind it was to do cyber liaisons with the international community and be in a place where we know it's a target-rich environment. So Estonia, being where it is on the map, was a perfect location for us to have it. It was a great, very much support from the U.S. ambassador, and it gave a good launching point to work with, whether it be for Ukrainians or for the Latvians or the Lithuanians, but also Bulgarians, Romanians. So we were able to communicate, collaborate, work with a wide variety of people, and then also help out with the local community there as well, right? Because businesses would have questions. So we would give presentations. We would work with local people about, cybersecurity and how to enhance, let's just say, your network defenses. So it was a very great opportunity to be able to, put yourself in Eastern Europe, live there for a period of time. For me personally, obviously, the expanding of who you are as an individual, better able to understand other cultures by living there.
Mm-hmm.
Traveling like I did, and I traveled quite extensively with the U.S. Secret Service, put me in a wide variety of countries where I was able to pick and choose kind of how is it that I want to present myself, or how is it that I want to represent myself. And so, you learn over time, and you learn about these different cultures, and you learn about the nuances, and you learn about the respect between them. And so when you do come across, which it happened quite a bit, other persons in other places in the world, there was a significant appreciation for not being what would be the phrase I hear often is your typical American, right? Whereas I need a menu in English. What is these numbers? I don't know what these numbers are. You understood almost immediately what they all were, and they appreciated that because you put forth an effort to understand it.
That office in Estonia, was it all manned by U.S. Secret Service?
So we were part of that embassy community. So it was interesting, whereas that, the FBI was present as well.
Okay.
They had an office, and so the Secret Service had an office. But the embassy in Estonia was a smaller embassy.
Mm-hmm.
So there was coverage regionally from other agencies outside. So I remember Amsterdam. I think it was HSI covered from Amsterdam. So other federal agencies didn't necessarily have persons in place at that embassy. But Department of State obviously was the main operator, and of course we were working underneath their, let's just say, authority.
Okay.
Right? So that time period, my boss was the ambassador, as was everybody else's, right?
Okay.
Deputy Chief of Mission.
Yeah.
Quote unquote, right? However, I still reported to the SAC out of Paris. It was main person. And then we also had a local supervisor.
So that's interesting. I guess I think of FBI, I think of DEA, I think of HSI. How prevalent are Secret Service agents throughout the world in the embassies? Are you like everybody else, all the other federal agencies?
No, not at all. FBI probably has the largest footprint,
Mhm.
right? They have the most resources throughout the globe. I think the U.S. Secret Service was more strategic on
Mhm.
how we placed our personnel and where we placed them. It was based on a variety of factors. But when you look at the total size of our organization and you compare it to other organizations, we didn't have the manpower that they had. Therefore, we couldn't staff embassies at the same level that they were able to staff it. So, whereas that the FBI may have at least some representation at, I would say, 95 to 99% of the U.S. embassies globally, there are certain ones, right, that you're not going to have represented. That's why I say less than 100%, because Iran, for example, or North Korea, we wouldn't necessarily have a footprint or a presence in those places.
Yeah.
So it wasn't a full 100% across the globe that you would have everyone in a country. But we tried to be strategic about where we placed our manpower, and we also looked at it as area of operation. And so, we didn't want to make a person be in Australia and have to travel all throughout, like the Middle East. So we would find people that would be in those places, and so that you can limit the amount of countries that you have to cover. But there was no doubt the Paris field office that I was part of, they had the largest district because they covered parts of Africa, the Middle East, and also almost all of Europe.
Hmm. Okay. The Secret Service Cyber Threat Intel Unit. Tell me what they do. And is it just you guys, or is it a task force with other people?
So the Cyber Threat Intelligence Unit was a special unit that was, again, it was born because of the threat, right, of the cyber criminal and the cyber threat actors. And so we had a mandate to do electronic crimes task forces. And so those were popping up more and more throughout the United States, and they were becoming more prevalent. And they would be targeting cases of interest for their districts. But then what we tried to do is also create a specialized unit that would be operated out of headquarters that was going to be not just focusing on regional, but all of the globe. And also try to be an aggregator of all information and be able to farm out like leads, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
So if we were, which we also did, able to touch every criminal that was interacting with the Secret Service and be able to look at the data that they had in their computer and then figure out other ways to find where connections were made to other persons and liaison with our partners internationally to be able to to use that data as well. We can start resourcing a wide variety of data points, and we can actually become more effective and more, let's just say, precise of who we were targeting, as opposed to if you just made an arrest of a person that was locally that was using credit cards. Now, it doesn't mean that he's not a significant person in the underground community, but at the same time, we want to be able to be strategic about how it is that we're going to go, because we have limited resources, about finding that next person. So, as opposed to, say, targeting the lower half of an apple tree, we were trying to target the upper half of an apple tree and make sure that the ones that we were picking were the top tier targets that were most likely to have the highest impact in whatever the criminal activity was. And typically, when you looked at when I was starting off, right, with Operation Carter Chaos, it was the theft of credit cards and then the vending of those credit cards, and it was global, right? It was a global aspect that you can sell these credit cards anywhere and you can have an impact on that, right? But as time progressed, by the time I got back to the Cyber Threat Intelligence Unit, we saw the trend happening beforehand, but you really got to see it firsthand there, where credit cards quickly became low tier work, and bank accounts and other means and methods of monies became more the business email compromise, and being able to perfect that to be able
Mm.
to impact, to go after larger dollar amounts. It was worth more of their time, energy, and efforts than it was to, say, hack TJX was one that lost 47 million credit cards, right? That one was significant at its time, and that was some of the data that I was buying back then.
Mm.
But now, the current landscape and where all of the most prolific actors were operating in was how to steal a crypto wallet, how to compromise a business's banking information, or a high wealth individual, of how to compromise their bank account and to have funds transferred to a bank that you might control. And they understood clearly that if they only had, say, $200,000 that was transferred to a bank account, but if they got out half of that money, it was again more impactful for them than it was to use, a couple of hundred credit cards where you're putting yourself at risk every time. So that was kind of where the focus and the mindset has changed. And of course, now currently, where are we at now? Currently, ransomware is probably one of the hottest topics that are talked about. So again, start ranking what criminal activity that you're able to accomplish. And when you start looking at who are the most prolific actors, threat actors that are out there, it's those people who can, get the initial access to be able to pivot, to map a network and put ransomware onto a person's computer system, and then be able to turn around and say, and by the way, it's kind of interesting because the first not that this is the first ransom, but the first ransom that made the most significant impact to like national headlines, I want to say was a payment of $16,000. Today it's in the millions.
Yeah.
Right, so it's completely the focus has changed, and they recognize, just like anyone would say, is you follow the money, you go where the money is, and this is what they've done, right? And they've retuned and retooled their efforts, and this is one of the biggest reasons why you see ransomware being so prolific.
So we just recently, last week, in fact, I think we had a major cell phone outage, and there's a lot of speculation. Some people are saying, maybe it's a target from another country and other stuff. But give me an idea from a cybersecurity expert, how vulnerable are we in the U.S. to infrastructure, electronic, our power grid, banking, water, everything like that. Give me an idea of what your take is.
Yeah, I mean, look, you don't have to look far; just Google it. You'll
Yeah.
get the answers that you're seeking. I mean, anyone can use Google these days, and as a matter of fact, if you can't use Google, just use AI, and it'll basically lead you down the path. But the reality is that the United States, unlike other countries, we have allowed private industry to manage most of our critical infrastructure. And if you look at just the whole guidance around providing security for whatever it is that you're, wrapping those layers of security around, they use words like reasonable. They use, based on the threat. But there's no solid direction of what it is that you're supposed to use or not use as you protect your networks. And so we've allowed, like I said, private industry to manage a lot of our critical infrastructure. And recently, I want to say that the CISA, along with the FBI, just put out a report letting the entire world know that, yes, we are highly susceptible to a compromise of critical infrastructure. Colonial Pipeline, if you recall that case,
Yeah.
a ransomware attack against a major mover of gas. They were out for several weeks, caused massive problems within our infrastructure in the United States. So there is a large amount of opportunity, and there is these warnings from our own critical infrastructure, let's just say organizations like the Bureau and others, who are warning us of the potential threat. So when you start talking about cell phone communications, right? I mean, Pegasus malware, it's been prevalent now for a very long period of time, where you have, because of that, right, Pegasus malware, you have it being more targeted in what they were doing. So, for example, they didn't use it on everybody. They targeted journalists and diplomats, and they were only looking at what is your communications. They wanted to know what people were talking about. They wanted to know what people are saying. Um, Obviously, Edward Snowden, huge case, right? WikiLeaks is what that led to. It's all about information. It's all about understanding what type of information. If they say information empowers, right? Or knowledge is power, but understanding what people are thinking and then figuring out strategies to combat that is very important, which is why you see a huge focus on trying to get into the communications of leaders of nations and or businesses. I mean, if you were able to be, let's just say, if you were to understand what the bid was for a major construction project and you were the main competitor, how would that benefit you? It could benefit you greatly to know what it is that they're trying to bid on, how they're bidding it, and what they're using in terms of numbers. Or maybe you look at the community that's offering a project, and getting that information and understanding where their bottom line is, then you can use strategy, and then you can be targeted, and you can be precise about how it is you go about that. So the fact that people are in communications, right? And when I say people, what I mean is either your advanced persistent threat or you're a criminal threat actor. It's because through communications you can benefit greatly, and that information, just like any other information, sometimes can become intellectual property. When I first started, intellectual property could be a stolen credit card number, which it is. It still is today. But intellectual property now can just be information.
Yeah.
It could be our conversations that we're having behind closed doors. It could be your board meeting about, say, for example, where it is they're going to invest or divest from. So all of this stuff is, and they recognize this. They recognize that. You can even look through, the archives. You'll see the targeted attacks on the Edgar system of the SEC, or the targeted attacks on Business Wire or PR Newswire. These cases were cases that I participated in as well, but that was all about stealing 8Ks and 10Ks that businesses were publishing or would be publishing, because they have to publish them publicly at some point. But if I can get to that information before it becomes public, I can make trades based on that.
Yeah.
And it becomes very valuable information. So when we start thinking about intellectual property and how to protect intellectual property, that scope is so wide nowadays. And the reliance of people, right, on their cell phone technology or their computer technology, that's where the information is. And if you can get to it, you can write your own tickets.
So following up on that, if you're king for the day, do you ban TikTok?
So TikTok is another interesting conversation. I think it goes to other technologies. TikTok isn't alone. It's really the underlying technology, who produces it, who makes it, and what is it that you're giving up.
Mm-hmm.
I laughed about it when I was living in Estonia, because for me and my age, and for my time when I was there, I would ask for people's telephone numbers, and that was almost like a taboo thing. Like, ooh, I'm not giving you my telephone number, but they would turn to me and say, well, what's your Facebook page? And I would laugh and be like, why do you want my Facebook page? First of all, I didn't have one at first, but I had to create one just because it was so popular. But what people in society today are not recognizing is, what is it you're giving up by having some of these things?
Right.
So if I gave you my telephone number, you have, theoretically, if it's a US number, you have, say, like 10 digits. That's it, right? Yeah, you can do a lot with those 10 digits, and you could target people with those 10 digits, theoretically. But if I give you my Facebook page and I open up the private sections with my Facebook page, before you know it, you've got my name, my family, my car, my dogs, my cats, everything about me. In my personal life, I've just opened up to a complete stranger at times. And these trends, right, with TikTok and other ones like this, what people, I think, fail to recognize is, what is it they're giving up. It could be where you would say, there's nothing that I own that's private or that's so secret that it can't be known to the rest of the world. But the reality is with AI technology, and with the fact that today, yes, you might be a student at a university, but tomorrow you could be a diplomat working for, a government. And the fact that they can get your data today and then leverage against you. Because remember, most, let's just say, advanced persistent threats or nation states, it's not the short game, it's the long game. And they recognize that if there's something that you do as a young person that makes hey, it's no big deal, all right, it's just this. But then later in life, that could be what they use to be able to challenge you. They could be using that to help convert you. They could use that to blackmail you. Or with generative AI, they can just use your images now based on conversations that you've had, or things you've uploaded in terms of your posts. So I think people need to be a little bit more thoughtful of what they're giving up in terms of their own private data. It's always interesting as well when you start turning the tables. The government can have nothing about me, but Facebook or Google can have everything about me.
Yeah.
And what they don't recognize is that, yes, if Google or Facebook or someone else like that has it, then anyone else can get it as
Yeah.
well. Right? So it's just a matter of methodology.
Fascinating. Okay, so 2 last questions I always ask. Did being in law enforcement affect your family?
So, that's always a hard question. I was married in the beginning, but I don't necessarily say that law enforcement was what caused the divorce
Mhm.
between my wife and I. But nonetheless, recognizing that being in law enforcement is more stressful than any other, industry, especially because of the dangers that you face, sometimes unknowingly. Today, it's a lot more stressful than it has been ever in the past. But there is a challenge, whether it be travel, whether it be working midnights, whether it be the shift work or weekends. So you do miss at times family events, You miss spending time with your family at some of the more critical junctures in their lives and your lives, right? So it's impactful, and I recognize that over my career, there have been birthdays that have been missed. There's been family reunions that have been missed, and so there is an impact on it, and there's definitely consequences to being in law enforcement that I think each person bears different weights, and it affects everybody differently. For me, I'd still say there was an impact, and there definitely had, you know, a I don't want to call that a negative output because I think that everything that I learned, I took and did the best I could to turn it into a positive, and being able to make it a benefit for me, and so I don't have any regrets about my career at any level.
Okay. Did being in law enforcement, if you can look back at your younger you, did being in law enforcement affect the way that you see people in society?
Oh, I mean, look, I talked about it a little bit earlier. Of course it did. I mean, one of the things you first start traveling and you start seeing other cultures and other countries and experiencing different things, and the expectation of how it is here in the United States, and it's not necessarily the same everywhere that you go, and being able to be open to those changes and being able to say, hey, and respectful of the different areas that you visit. It doesn't matter what country it is. And I've been to your wealthiest nations in the world, and I've been to some of your poorest nations in the world, and how you're able to adapt to those scenarios and still be able to find the benefits and the uniqueness and all of those things, I think, has had an effect on me and made me a better person as a result of it. And I did the best I could to try to meet people as I traveled, and sometimes I've created some very good, long-lasting relationships with people that are still intact today. And I think that is a benefit of being able to travel and being able to expand your mind and to be able to be more open about other societies of how they live and how they operate, and appreciate the fact that not everything is going to be like it is in the United States or where you grew up, right? Whether it is, say, you coming from outside the United States and coming into to our country, right? So it's being able to be flexible, to understand the differences in culture, to be respectful. So those things are all huge benefits that I may not have had I not joined the Secret Service.
Rich, thank you for the interview. It was really fascinating. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, no, thank you for having me. I greatly appreciate your time, and thank you for everything as well
Yeah,
that you do.
thanks.